Hey, this is the 8-9s team. We've got Galen here, designer, Kyle.
I'm Kyle, a Unity developer.
And Thomas.
Hello, this is Thomas, the animation director.
So we're going to be today just walking through some of the HoloLens stuff, specifically in this case, the Roam tour from the HoloTours application. You may have seen the little sort of review of that with Adam Shepard prior to this, and we're just going to kind of walk through some of the aspects and talk a little more in detail about what we think is interesting about it, what we think is perhaps a good jumping off point to talk about some more detailed HoloLens stuff. So let's jump in here. So I've just cut together a little video of a bunch of the clips that we recorded. This is the intro of the HoloTour application. It does some nice stuff with fading out your environment and adding a little bit of like a starscape with some planets, as you can see in the background, and then with Earth in the center. It's kind of a nice intro because a lot of the HoloLens applications are taking advantage of your environment, and this one kind of is a little more of a VR type thing. Which is a little bit interesting, and it does it surprisingly well. I don't know if you guys have thoughts about that, but
Yeah, I was very impressed how immersed I felt this entire experience. It does a good job of leveraging the spatial mapping and finding the floor of your room specifically to give a really immersive, in-depth experience.
I can't remember off the top of my head. Does it require you to place anything on the floor for calibration, or is it just auto-recognize the room scan?
It does recognize the room. So I think once you wear the HoloLens, it does recognize the room and then create some spatial mapping.
Right.
I think this experience is pretty cool because it's a combination of both virtual reality and mixed reality. Say when you're browsing the Earth, it is like in a VR setup. But say when you're in Rome, when you're on the physical ground, etc., it does recognize the room, and then so there are some relative placements, etc. So
right. I thought this part was actually interesting, and this is the sort of intro to the experience. So there's this. I believe this is done with photogrammetry. This painting, and this is a representation of the Rome environment. But I think this is interesting because it kind of jumps you out of the VR experience a little bit and into a more traditional MR experience. And it kind of takes advantage of this technique that they've been using where it shifts your world as you walk. I don't know if you guys noticed that when you were doing it, but if you move out of kind of the range of the environment, it starts to actually shift you, or shift the world around you to kind of accommodate so that you're not moving out of the space.
Yep. Looks like we have a question from Kafka the Cockroach Man. I think we need to go back in the video a little bit to answer it.
Okay. Let me put that there.
And a quick note on the spatial mapping on this one. After it does map it, something I've noticed with the HoloLens mapping is it's really great, but it's not perfect. And this experience after it's mapped gives you the opportunity to move your floor to adjust it in case it is too high or too low.
There we go. So the question is, so the Earth is CG and the darker background is the actual room. So the Earth is CG, but the darker background is also CG, so you can see a little bit hints. I mean, it may be kind of hard to tell, but the actual room is there a little bit. But for the most part, it's obscured by this kind of star field and the planet or the moon up in the corner, and then Earth in the center. But in this case, all of this is computer generated. So jump back to where we were. This is the intro. So this is another interesting aspect, and this is something that I think is one of the more compelling parts of this demo. So you can see here, this is actual footage. So this is 360 video that was taken of this plaza. But that's actually combined with some elements that are CG. Pull this back here.
Yeah, this is the first time that I saw 360 video inside the HoloLens, and I was very impressed with how immersive it was. It really takes over the room more than anything that I've seen so far.
Yeah, and I guess a quick note on that, it's kind of interesting about the field of view, because I know that's been kind of a topic of discussion, I'll say. But the field of view kind of fades away after you're in this experience for a little while. I don't know if you guys have kind of noticed that, but at least for me, after maybe 5 minutes in the experience, I really didn't notice the field of view.
Yeah, like with most HoloLens apps, the field of view isn't a concern after the initial bit of the app, and this one even more so with the 360 video, because everywhere you look, it looks like there's people next to you.
Yeah, I think that is definitely one thing that people notice right away when they try HoloLens, like the limited field of view, or what we call the rectangle space of frustum, and that is definitely a topic of itself when it comes to designing for holographic experience. But I think here in terms of, like Kyle and Galen mentioned, that it works so well, I think it's probably because since it's a 360 panoramic image or video, like there's almost like there is no limit, that wherever you turn, there is just like something else to see. So I think it does help dissolve that frustum or like limited field of view issue, versus if you're designing an experience like holographic image that is gigantic, but it's not like surrounding like a 360 degrees, then that can become an issue.
That's a good point.
Yeah. So this is also another point of this that I think is one of the more interesting parts of this application in general, and that's the combination of CG and actual captured footage. And I think, Thomas, you could probably talk about that a little bit as far as the photogrammetry aspect of that, and the differences, because maybe some people don't know the differences between photogrammetry and actual models.
So photogrammetry is a way of using multiple photographs from all angles, and then the computer helps calculate and assembling those pictures that measuring its say two cameras. If there is an overlapping pixel, then the computer can recognize it and try to stitch it up, and then use those pictures to generate a physical model instead of you have to model all by yourself. On the other hand, in a conventional 3D modeling, is you model everything by yourself. Either you use 3D programs or you use 3D sculpting programs to kind of sculpt the model. And in this case, in the room experience, where the paintings on the canvas and easels, I can see things going. It can be both direction. It can be a photogrammetry, or it can simply be like a simple modeling and then put the texture on top of it. I think photogrammetry comes really handy, and it shines when, say for example, if it's a sophisticated sculpture that you want to capture from real life, then that's where photogrammetry would definitely be appropriate. For easels like these, it might be more efficient if you model it yourself, because photogrammetry, the downside of it is there is a concern of the high density of the geometry itself. And then I think there are
Yeah, there was a
questions.
question. There was just a clarifying question about what FOV stands for. That stands for field of view. So if you haven't used the HoloLens before, your view is not constrained by like a black box or anything, but at a certain point at the edge of your vision, the holograms don't show up. In the same way that if you've used something like a VR headset, at a certain point the edge of the headset will go to black because you are not seeing the screen, you're seeing the sides of the headset. So that's field of view, or FOV. I just got another question. Can you capture photogrammetry just like Google/GoPro rig, or do you need something fancier? Or just using a GoPro rig or something fancier? I am not super knowledgeable about this. Thomas may know more. I have heard about people doing photogrammetry with something like a Lazy Susan and a DSLR. And I think you could probably do it with a GoPro array as well. I don't know if you know more about this, Thomas.
For photogrammetry, you can take pictures simply using your cell phones. Or on the other extreme, you can use like professional DSLR. Photogrammetry, in order to capture the image that is able to support photogrammetry to generate models, is you can think of it almost as kind of like a reverse process than taking the 360 video. 360 video, if you want to capture 360 video or 360 photo, you kind of put the camera on a like tripod or Lazy Susan, like Galen mentioned. Then you kind of like spin it around for 360 degrees. Then you kind of capture like panoramic of all the footage. Photogrammetry, on the other hand, is kind of a reverse process. That think of the nodal point. It is replaced by the object that you want to capture. For example, a statue. Then you actually carry the camera and then you kind of like walk around it and taking pictures as much as possible for say 360 degrees. So the more overlappings of pictures that you take between each picture, I heard say if you're taking a picture, the rule of thumb is it needs to be at least like 30% of overlapping of each picture in order to generate a nice photogrammetry.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I guess that we could keep going on the photogrammetry topic a little bit. So you were saying earlier that the danger of the photogrammetry technique is that it generates a lot of polygons and the assets become just kind of weighty when you're trying to do an application like that. Mm-hmm. Are there streamlined processes to trim that stuff down to make them more akin to something like that, or a way to replace parts of the photogrammetry with hand-modeled stuff that makes them a little lighter for usage?
Yeah, I'm a little bit familiar with that subject, and I also looked into it. It's if you're interested, you can look up, say, photogrammetry plus Mudbox or photogrammetry plus ZBrush. There is definitely a like now more established approach of how to capture photogrammetry and how to optimize the model and how to extract the photos in order to paint over the optimized texture. To sum up in a very simplistic steps, first you capture videos, second you generate photogrammetry, third you make either you optimize the photogrammetry generated point cloud models or you model a low poly self. Fourth step, you arrange the UV and then repainted it either in Mudbox or ZBrush. And then fifth, that's your outcome of an optimized lightweight model.
Cool. Well, we can move on with the video here. So at this part of the experience, you're kind of just looking around this plaza and looking at kind of the people and the easels and everything. And during this part, there's some narration about this plaza in Rome and just talking about a little bit of its history. And as the experience goes on, you start to sort of interact with these paintings, and you can see, like that painting there is a painting of the plaza from above. So this is actually a piece here where the ground dips away or falls down, and you can kind of look into layers of sediment across the years, and it kind of gives you a more historical view. We've got a question of if we built this. We did not. This is an experience built by Microsoft. This is one of their demos called HoloTours, and this is something that they put together in kind of the intro package for HoloLens as it goes out to developers. So this is actually kind of interesting to me, design perspective wise, because this is kind of a trend I've seen, at least in my experience working with some of this stuff, is 3D UI. So in this case, this is a measurement of depth that would normally be done with just through like flat stuff. If you're familiar with Canvas in Unity, it's sort of a UI system that's all generally flat objects like PNGs or JPEGs or whatever that are either billboarded means facing the camera at all times, or placed in the environment. And this is kind of interesting. It's a trend that's emerging with working on HoloLens, is UI that actually has depth and physicality to it. And in my experience, I found that it really adds a layer of immersion when you're seeing, instead of like a floating piece of text, you're seeing a like physical object in your space.
Can you go back to where it shows the pillar? I want to
Yeah.
talk about something from the development perspective. If any of you are familiar with Unity or have used it before, you can probably imagine the camera is the HoloLens. And there are a lot of cool tricks that you can do to make people feel really immersed, because since they're wearing the HoloLens, the camera is always where they are. And here you see the ground has dropped away. And when I first saw it, I was like, whoa, how does it, it drops away all around me, and I'm on this pillar. Well, it's like Galen talked about earlier, when you're moving out of the bounds of this, it kind of moves with you. And it looks here like it draws the pillar on the camera location, which gives the illusion that you're standing on the pillar. It's just one of the easy but powerful ways that you can be immersed in a HoloLens experience.
Yeah, and that's actually something that I think is kind of borrowed from a lot of VR experiences these days. A lot of the VR experiences that are coming out recently, at least, have been taking advantage of the ideas of like scale and depth. And one of the really powerful tools is playing with that. And I guess I was surprised when I initially did this demo at how well it works with HoloLens, because you would expect in some sort of mixed reality situation, your surrounding environment would start to break the illusion of depth, but it's pretty compelling and pretty convincing to see this pillar fall, or to see the ground fall away around you. And watching a lot of people do this experience, it's really fun to see, and this happens in VR experiences as well, is to see people kind of like walk over to the edge but be afraid to step over it. And a couple people who I've shown this demo have actually stepped off the pillar, and have said it's a super weird feeling to feel like you're floating above this empty pit. But it's surprising how well and how almost easy it is to employ an effect like this that gets a pretty significant reaction for relatively little design work and development work.
If I can add some comments in terms of designing, say this example of standing on the pillar and feel like a very dramatic sense of depth. I think this is a similar principle of architectural projection mapping that we've seen over the years. You see, especially at night, then you see there's a huge, powerful projectors that is projecting on a building, and it's kind of like literally morphing the surface. So I think to a certain degree, it's a fairly similar design principle because both the architectural projection mapping as well as HoloLens, they are essentially additive approach. So think of it as you're wearing, it might sound strange, but you're wearing a projector on your head and you're seeing a projected photons on top, overlaying on the physical surface. So so there is definitely a possibility of design principle waiting to be explored in that regard. At the same time that both projection mapping as well as HoloLens, it shares the same restriction or restriction in terms of HoloLens performs better when it's in a controlled lighting environment. That means like if you're in a darker room, you might enjoy the experience better than if you're under the sunlight. Because imagine if you're watching a movie with a projector, it might be hard to see. So that's basically the same principle. So that brings up another interesting point I want to quickly point out is for HoloLens, since it's additive, so that means there is no true black. So that means when it comes to designing the color pattern, etc., it will be an interesting learning experience of if you want to design something cool with dark color, chances are it might be a little bit challenging when it comes to showing up well in a holographic image, because darker color means it's more transparent, especially when you're in a brighter environment.
So we've got a question here. I just stepped out for a second. I don't know if this has been answered, but there's a question about if we've built anything on HoloLens. We have, yes. We actually worked on a project for Citibank that's up on our website, 8minds.com. You can take a look at our case study for that. And
we also put together a Merlin engine model that expands to show all the parts that make it up and collapses for a quick demo to show off the potential engineering capabilities of HoloLens, which we also have a video of on our site and Facebook.
Yeah.
And then we have projects we're working on now that we can't share quite yet.
Yeah. That would actually, it's kind of a good jumping off point to kind of, I think, dive deeper a little bit into just what it's like to work on HoloLens. At least, oh, great, we posted that in the chat. Excellent. So, at least from a design perspective, one of the key kind of tenets that we've started to follow and we've realized over working on some projects with HoloLens is you have to see it in the headset. That's a really kind of important thing to keep in mind is things that look good either on paper or especially on paper, but even in Unity, they may look great in Unity, but translating them into the lens, you really need to test that stuff rigorously, and it's all about kind of prototyping and iterating, as opposed to maybe a more traditional process that's around developing and then implementing and then shipping. I think the iteration process becomes vitally important with HoloLens to be able to just look at something in a 3D space, which there really aren't any other venues that you can do that type of experience in the same way. I don't know if you guys can talk about some of the more nuanced parts of the development process, but
well, first off, I agree with you, Galen, that they need to be seen in the HoloLens. Tools to see them are in the Unity engine, which is just 3D models, and there's also a HoloLens emulator, which is a step up from Unity, but it lacks a lot of the functionality of the HoloLens, and it's obviously on a 2D screen, so really not the same. As far as things specific to HoloLens for development, The whole build process is very important because, like Galen said, we need to iterate over things quickly. So being able to build quickly and deploy to the HoloLens is important, as well as building tools that let designers and modelers quickly insert their creations and ideas and check out how they look in the lens.
Yeah, actually that's a good jumping off point just for design stuff. During the process of working on the Citibank holographic workstation project, one of the things that I found incredibly useful was kind of diving deeply into Maya. I actually have a background a little bit in 3D modeling. I learned in Maya and then transferred over to Cinema 4D. But I think any 3D program, even something like SketchUp, just having familiarity with how to work in those programs is really useful because it allows you to prototype similar to a more traditional design workflow with something like Photoshop or Illustrator. It allows you to lay out and prototype, but in a 3D space. Which I think is super useful, and just being able to position objects in a way that you can understand them in a 3D space and then see them in a HoloLens. It gives you a clear or a more clear kind of sense of how things work when you're designing, and you can really start to build kind of a better way of communicating with developers when you're talking about things in a 3D kind of mindset, and this also handing off prototypes in a 3D fashion as opposed to 2D prototypes, which are still useful, but are harder to translate into 3D. So I think working in 3D is just a skill that designers will have to develop over the course of working in VR and AR, and it's a very relevant skill set, especially well, also, I guess, with Unity, working in Unity and being able to implement that stuff at a very basic level is really valuable. Kafka or
Wacky
Cockroach
Jack has
Man.
a-
Yeah. Let me get to that first.
So-
Unity uses JavaScript. Yeah, you can answer that.
Unity, the C# is kind of the leading language for it and the most used, but it also does have a JavaScript implementation. It's a bit different than JavaScript on the web because it uses Unity's tools and the API that they've built for it. And I think there's also another language called Boo.
It's Python.
It's Python. Yeah. So those are the three that I know of. But if you are comfortable with JavaScript, you can be just fine programming Unity with that.
And I've actually, from just a little bit of digging, I actually used to do a little bit of very amateur game development in Unreal, and so I kind of got familiar with node-based coding systems. And node-based coding systems are kind of hard to explain in language, so you may just need to look up node-based coding. But those, I think, are really intuitive and relatively simple systems for somebody who doesn't want to necessarily learn a bunch of code, for them to be able to prototype things. And there are quite a few options out there for Unity to do a very similar thing. There's one called Playmaker, and then there's one called Node Canvas that allow you to do some sort of node-based scripting for very basic things like moving cubes around. And it allows, I think, designers and people who are just getting into this space to prototype a lot quicker and a lot more intuitively than having to sink a lot of time into learning a coding language if they don't necessarily, that's not necessarily part of their job or part of their interest.
Yeah. If you're familiar with UML diagrams, it's almost like interactive UML diagrams, which is very cool.
Yeah. So there's another question about Blender. So Blender is definitely a good tool. I would say I haven't dug into Blender too much as far as my own experience with working with it. I think Thomas, I don't know if you have experience. Thomas is primarily a Maya guru, but do you have experience with Blender?
I don't use Blender, but I do hear time to time friends who use Blender. So I think essentially they are the tool, softwares depending on which one that you're most comfortable with, and then depending on exactly what you want to do. If for purely modeling purpose and purely like UV wrapping purpose, if you're if you're comfortable with Blender, then use Blender. If it's Maya, then use Maya. Cinema 4D, 3D Max, etc. I mean, ultimately it doesn't really matter because all the assets that you create, you have to kind of still go through a game engine, say in HoloLens example, Unity, in order to output it to the Unity to be able to see what you built. So it's not like a traditional approach of like, you model and then you do the rigging, you do the weight painting, texture, etc., effects, deformation and rendering and output. Like it's almost like there are only few steps like modeling, texturing, unwrapping, rigging, animation done, and then all the rest happens in Unity. So it doesn't really matter which program you're familiar with or you want to learn. They are all good programs.
I'm curious, Thomas, what?
Oh, and Houdini. Sorry, Houdini is also a very good one too.
Oh yeah, yes. Rep Houdini.
So Wacky Jack, it's interesting because I come from a web development background and JavaScript was my main language. And if you're interested in getting into object-oriented languages like C# or like Gears of War said, Java, C# is a great language to learn, and it comes really easily when you're learning it in Unity with Unity.
Yeah, I will just a quick tack on that, but I want to get back to a thought I had. But a quick pin on that is that Unity's documentation is incredibly strong, and any term in the sort of scripting purview, any of that is all documented super rigorously, and like all the relationships to different terms and different elements of that process are all documented. So it's super easy to get a sense of what you're doing and like run through tutorials. Even me, who I'm come from like very, very low level sort of code knowledge, I would found it pretty reasonable to start picking up some of that stuff.
Maybe I can chip in on it too.
Sure, yeah.
So I pick up programming language like throughout my kind of career. I was originally more of a like Python guy. So when I started picking up C#, it was kind of a culture shock. It was like, oh, like the way of thinking is very different.
It's really weird to declare the type of something when you're doing the variable. That was weird for me.
Yeah, it's like type specific. So I remember there was definitely kind of what's that called, like a transitional like pain, as if you're growing teeth. But I think it's manageable. Like if I think AR, VR, or mixed reality, it's just so exciting. I think it's, and like the application is so popular. It's not something vague that I have to consider whether it's worth it learning C# or not. Like, well, if for developing HoloLens, for using Unity, you learn C#. That's very straightforward. So it's a bit of growing pain, but I think it's definitely very manageable if you learn a bit of like programming before, like HTML or Java or Python, JavaScript, etc. I think you will have no problem picking up the new language.
So Brit has a question. I want to jump back to that very quickly, but I really quick want to touch on something that you were saying, Thomas, about animation. And I'm curious what the balance between doing sort of programmatic animation in Unity and doing like baked animation in Maya or whatever 3D software, where do you find the balance is as far as developing, and where does it seem like the most comfortable to go between the two?
I think in terms of prototyping, that's a very good question. I mean, I definitely, like see a different perspective, especially when we start working on HoloLens. I think procedural animation using code-based or baked animation using 3D app, there's definitely a balance or like better scenarios of which one to use in what scenario. But if I can say, the bottom line is whatever tool you're in the most comfortable with, then go with it. That I think proved to be true in our iteration and prototyping process. That different people in our team have kind of like come from different backgrounds. Some are very good at programming, procedural animation, and I and Galen, for example, are probably more of a like 3D animation background, so like definitely like hanky animation and bake it out, etc. But for prototyping, it doesn't really matter. Like if you are efficient enough, if you know the tool well enough, then it doesn't necessarily have to go one way or another. I think that question comes into play when it goes from prototyping to a real product. When you are ready to kind of wrap up and become like a real project before you ship it out, then it's kind of like you move beyond prototyping. Then you have to consider whether baked animation is more efficient or procedural is more lightweight for the app file.
That's interesting. Okay, so to jump back to BritGrit's question, asking about how long you find it's comfortable to wear the lens. I find it's pretty comfortable to wear for a reasonably long amount of time. The things that I find that make me uncomfortable with the lens are more around the VR, same like type of thing with VR, with like VR sickness. So if there are judders and judder is just like things sort of jumping around in crazy ways, I find that is the thing that makes me the most uncomfortable wearing the lens. The other thing I will say is that you have to find kind of the right sitting position for it to be comfortable, kind of like on your head. But once you've found that, I find the physical device is not too much of a problem. But if, like, when we're prototyping experiences, there's often times where things won't run at the right frame rate, or they'll kind of jump around because of tracking, and those are not necessarily problems with the hardware, but just part of the prototyping process, and that I find is the thing that makes me the most uncomfortable, but it's kind of the same as in VR. VR also has the similar problems of being uncomfortable during the prototyping process. And it's kind of a good segue. Gears of Warmonger says, do you guys do any VR, Oculus 5, Samsung? So yes, we have done one experience on the Gear VR called The Box. That was kind of a short little narrative piece, definitely kind of a passion project for us, and especially Thomas and I. I think we really enjoyed working on something that was very personal and fun and cute and very, emotional, I suppose. And we have worked on Oculus. We put out a demo there where you're kind of flying around an iceberg and diving underwater. It's another experiential piece. Vive, we've prototyped some things around with, but we don't have anything out currently. But we do mess around with all of those headsets pretty frequently. So then there is a question about glasses. So that's a really good question. A lot of us do wear glasses in the office. I very specifically wear big old glasses on my face. And with the HoloLens, it's pretty comfortable. I would actually advise the little nose piece, the bridge part that has the little bridge pads that sit on your nose. I would advise removing that. It just slides out. But if you're going to wear it with glasses, I think that makes it a little more comfortable. But it's pretty comfortable otherwise. You just kind of have to get the right positioning.
Yeah, I can add to that too. I wear glasses too, and my glass frame is pretty huge. So I'm actually decently surprised HoloLens that it kind of like, it fits pretty well with my huge glass frame. And like Galen mentioned, that there is a nose piece. It depends on like whether that is in the way or not. But I felt overall it's pretty comfortable, and especially I know, from the online forums, there seems to be discussion about people recommending wearing, putting those extra strip that comes with the HoloLens. It seems that it adds extra stability and then make it more comfortable to wear it on like a longer time. So I can't wait to try that out too, actually.
Yeah. So we have a really good question from Luker82. How quickly do you go from a storyboard to working dirty prototype?
From the development perspective, as soon as I hear kind of a pitch of a project, even before anything has happened, I'll start prototyping what I think might be necessary. And since sometimes it takes so long to get from ideation to concrete designs or plans, it really helps me to just kind of cover all the bases I can before that even happens. So for me, Luker, like immediately after we find out we've got a project, I'll start prototyping.
And that's really interesting. I guess there's a quick question about what is a dirty prototype. That's basically just, I mean, it's not really an official term, but just kind of throwing together a very quick prototype that's not necessarily representative of the final models or the final shape.
I'll just drop in like a couple cubes or spheres or whatever and start doing the stuff to them that might need to happen with whatever models we eventually get. From the modeling perspective, it's probably quite a bit different since modeling takes so much time. You can't really waste time on something that won't be in there. What do you think, Thomas?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a bigger topic that I think I'm excited to learn about it, or it would probably be a topic out of itself for another time. But long story short, it seems like, say, prototyping, like Kyle said, is you before you have the final asset, there are also like way of interactions or kind of effects that you want to achieve in a kind of interactive design approach. So before, so like you just throw in like a simple cube or something and you start designing and start writing code. To a certain degree, that is a pretty similar approach to animation. Like say animation, before we have the final design or the final story, etc. There is also a similar approach. We have like very rough model that we can quickly move around, etc. That can be helpful for prototyping or pre-visualization process. But I think in comparison, animation is definitely a more, or CG production is definitely a more strict process that we need to have things locked down way earlier than prototyping for programmer. Programmer, it seems we like extreme flexibility from the very beginning, so we can experiment tons of different stuff before we lock down what is the design that we want to do in terms of programming.
Right, yeah.
And just to jump back to the storyboard note, I think that's a really interesting topic, especially from a design perspective. This is something that I've been kind of thinking about throughout our process of developing with Lens, and especially with the Lens, but VR also, of how to kind of handle scripting out these sequences, scripting out these experiences, laying out kind of the interaction. Because one of the things about a storyboard is oftentimes it's very limiting in how it kind of shows you how to run through an experience, and oftentimes the experiences that we're working on or the experiences that we are kind of thinking about, like the engine demo that we put together, the engineering piece, is kind of a good example that didn't really have a start or end. It just had a bunch of actions that you could run through and a bunch of sort of different permutations and ways you can interact with this object. And that's something that a storyboard almost doesn't really cover. So I find, or at least in our experience, what I've found is useful is almost going more towards something like a beat sheet, which is just running through the like core things that need to happen. Not so much like this is exactly how this thing moves from one side of your environment to the other, but more focused on like, and now you expand the engine, now you collapse the engine, and being less specific about those things, and then working out some of the details of the interactions and the animations and things in the iteration phase, and maybe storyboarding out individual interactions. But that's kind of one of the challenges of moving into this space, and that kind of segues into one of Cockroach Man's questions, which is about being a web designer and moving into this space, is that it's a lot less linear than a lot of sort of, not older methodologies, but things like web and mobile tend to be a little more linear in the way that you think about progressing somebody through an experience. And I've found oftentimes working in VR and MR, they're a little less linear, and you need to think about things in a little more holistic view, and then break things down into the smaller pieces as you develop the experience.
Yeah, if I can, I can add a bit of input in this topic. I think mixed reality is such a new, I mean, it's been developed like through decades, but ultimately it's kind of like finally becomes kind of like a bit more mature. We actually can kind of like develop the content for it. But essentially, I think it's kind of like a pretty new medium that we're still, you know, like very excitedly developing a way to develop content. I think it's almost like two spectrums. Like either it's develop something truly interactive, or it's like narrative storytelling. But I find that most of the time it's somewhere in between. So I think Galen, he pointed out a very interesting point of like the beats. I think that is definitely a good way to start thinking in that regard. And it's I think it's definitely a upcoming topic. I just read a blog posted by Story Studio, Oculus Story Studio. They also noticed that similar challenge when they're making their project Henry. So I think it's definitely an interesting topic of how to combine two drastically different domain, or like a medium like narrative storytelling that is like very strict. You almost have to kind of nail down the script, the storyline before you start producing, versus from interactive software developed point of view, like you want absolute freedom to experiment features, and how does both medium meet in the middle. So yeah, it's a interesting topic.
Yeah, for sure. This is something we're kind of continually thinking about, and specifically I'm continually kind of trying to develop more smooth ways to think about planning out these experiences, and it's definitely a fun little nugget to mull on. Luker82 has another question about how easy or difficult is it to code interactions with objects? Is it a large learning curve, or are there user-friendly means of scripting the interactions? So I think this kind of goes back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier with things like Node Canvas and Playmaker. Those are a couple of node-based tools that will allow you to script interactions and behaviors and things like that in Unity, and specifically in Unity, or if you're working in Unreal, it has built-in tools for that. It allows you to script those things in a little more user-friendly way, and especially for me, I found as a designer coming from basically only knowledge of HTML and CSS, I was able to jump into node-based scripting pretty quickly and pretty easily. It's fairly intuitive, and I found like I could make things like little mini games and prototype little interactions and things like that with these tools a lot quicker than it would if I was sort of trying to dive into actual code. I'm sure, though, there are other resources that Kyle could talk about, or Thomas could talk about, as far as the ease of picking up some of those code things. And I guess a good question, because this is something that I was doing initially when I was learning a little bit about C# and other coding languages. Kind of every time I've tried to pick it up, is I'm oftentimes copying and pasting other people's code and trying to understand what it's doing and modifying it. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about that kind of approach to learning the basics of code or scripting in Unity.
It came pretty easy to develop some interactions between objects, and the learning curve is small for that. Just like it is if you're new to web, scripting some basic things. But as a project gets to a real size, you notice the same thing where you really have to have it well architected. Otherwise, stuff starts getting buggy or falling apart. So good programming fundamentals will carry over from any discipline that you're currently in and carry over to Unity. And the tools that they provide for object interaction and moving them, and their very powerful platform makes that aspect easy, but the underlying fundamentals are always needed to be there to keep your code running well.
If I can, piggyback behind what Kyle's experience. Say my experience is more from like a not like very strict computer science background, but it's kind of like picking up along the way. So maybe that will provide different insight. I find that picking up Python is relatively easy and straightforward, and it was fun. But then from Python transition to C#, for example, since it's object-oriented programming, there is a kind of a steep learning curve, but I think it's definitely manageable. It just, from my experience, it definitely seems like you just need to be patient, and definitely kind of like, I think it's important to pick up the basics and build like strong foundations. And I think for my personal experience, I find that it takes me about like 6 months to finally become comfortable and able to be productive in C#.
Yeah.
So if that gives any perspective for people who are interested and in similar background.
Mm-hmm. And like all programming, you'll make your first project and you'll be all real excited at the beginning, and you're doing everything right, and it gets bigger and bigger, and you finish it, and you move on to your next project, and you've learned so much that you're like doing everything even more and more right, and you look back to that first project and you're like, what was I thinking doing this? So the learning curve there is the same as I've experienced with any programming language or paradigm or platform.
Well, I think we can jump back to the video. That was a super long set of tangents there, but we can jump back to the video here a little bit. As you saw before, this is the part with the pillar and the floor kind of dropping out underneath you. Just to recap what I said before, I think it's a really kind of cheap and easy way to get some kind of exciting value out of playing with scale and playing with depth. So this actually is a really good example of taking that a little bit further. So this is jumping you from the ground where you were before in that plaza up to a hot air balloon. So now you're looking at the plaza from above, and this is actually that painting you saw before. And I think that's just a nice little piece of narrative sort of tie back or callback, I guess, that they hint at this part of the experience prior. And that's just sort of good storytelling. But I think this is a really nice way to pull back from this very rich experience being on the ground, and now looking at it from above, you get a totally different sense of the space. And this is another point where they're just taking advantage of scale and taking advantage of depth and height, and you really get to see a lot more of the environment. And I find that this is a neat way to play with scale, because it doesn't actually break sort of the continuity of the experience. You're still at human scale, but you get to see the environment as if it were, as if you were a giant. And I think that's a nice way in VR and MR to kind of make you feel more immersed and put you in situations you wouldn't see before. And this is kind of interesting. This hot air balloon, I believe, and this is actually right up to the end of this video, but this hot air balloon, I believe, is all generated. And so that's kind of an interesting jumping off point, I think, for Thomas to talk about just sort of the process of thinking about how to integrate between different sources for models. So, for example, pulling from models that were generated from photogrammetry and then models that were generated by hand, and kind of what your thoughts are about mixing between the two, and just that process of developing this is kind of a design question too, but developing like a universal style and language for everything in an experience.
I think there are some it's a very impressive experience for sure. And without being in the actual production team, all is about speculation.
Of course, yeah.
So with my educated guess, I think it's in order to create these assets, photogrammetry's data is definitely extremely helpful, because photogrammetry, not only you're able to generate point clouds of models or landscapes from all the photos that you took and processed, but that means like all the photos that you took are essentially the source file for the textures. So in this example, for instance, like if you build a simple geometry of those buildings, it doesn't need to be sophisticated, etc. But you can literally just like apply the same textures that you took from your photographs. All the colors are baked in, and all the lights are baked in, and all the colors are and textures are baked in already. So if you then put in a simple light, or if you put in a simple light, then to create like shadows to make it more realistic, to have a directionality of the light, then there you go. I think it's definitely a way to do. I think it also reminds me to a certain degree similar approach of, like, say if you get those like free assets or like free resource you can extract from Google Earth, for instance. Those like simple geometries with textures can already provide like a lot more for you to kind of play around in these. For example, like these, I consider this would be a similar approach. And I know in Unity, you can go with the like default light, and with the text, all the illusions of lights and shadows and realistic looking is all in the textures and lights. I know in Unity you can also bake lights, and you can even use the physical based shaders that you can play with the HDRI to make the light even more realistic, reflecting to bind the models and the backdrop sky maps even better. So that would be my take.
I stepped out at this moment, but Thomas, I don't know if you talked about kind of another section of this topic, which is how do you kind of merge models with the real environment?
Oh, yes.
Because
Yes.
I think that's a really interesting thing. This is part of another demo that we're not showing today, but we may show in the future. The Bad Conquer demo, which has a bunch of objects placed in your environment. Another one is fragments, but that takes over your environment a little bit. But these are other HoloLens demos that shipped at the same time as this demo. But a few of them really do a good job of placing objects in your environment and starting to build out that. And I wonder, Thomas, I'm sure you have insight on that part of it.
I think if trying to sum it up in a few points, texture is absolutely important, and sky map with HDRI high dynamic range map, using that as light source definitely helps. That is also essentially a similar approach as like a realistic CG rendering. And the third one is depending on whether the experience you're moving around or if it's kind of like you're essentially in another point. In Rome experience, yes, you can walk around, but essentially if you are like a couple of feet like like away, since you're in a balloon, you can treat the walking distance as a kind of fractional difference as if you're in another position. So when in another position, that means there is no distortion. So that means it's a great opportunity to combine the 360 footage as well with the 3D models, because you won't notice any sliding around if you place them correctly. So that's a great tip for integration.
All right. Great.
It's funny you mentioned that Gears of War monger, because I've been thinking the same thing as we've been doing this. It's been amazing how patient you guys have been with the questions, but I think we have a lot of depth to go into, and a podcast would be perfect.
Yeah, I agree. So that's kind of the end of this Rome experience. There's a lot more to explore. I just stole that line there, but I kind of cut out a lot of the meat of this experience. So you guys, if you get a chance to see this on the HoloLens, you absolutely should. But that's kind of the end of our sort of analysis of this experience, and sort of lots of tangents about working on HoloLens and stuff. But we will eventually be back with some other footage, maybe talking about it in a similar way or doing a podcast. We're still figuring it out, but that's been that. And I'd like to thank everyone who showed up to actually, for being here and asking questions. It was a good discussion, I think. Got some good stuff out. So.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you guys.